let's get started. Couple of things here at the beginning. There are new food blogging prompts up on Moodle, so go and look at those. The first prompts are related to Halloween, which we just went through yesterday. Also, I meant to take up your food journals last week because last week was the end of the last food blogging deal, so turn in your food journals, drop them by my office sometime today so I can get those graded and get them back to you. Remember that the food journals are due at the same time the food blogging is due, so every 2-week period. At the end of the food blogging, that's when you turn in your food journals. So there is that. First set of prompts are about Halloween, second set of prompts are about history. So just follow the instructions on the Moodle site about that. And like I said, get your food journals into me sometime today. Second thing is the college has relaxed mask mandates a couple of times now so far this semester. The college is actually doing a really good job both on the student side of things as well as on the faculty staff side of things. Actually, the faculty staff side of things was actually quite good at the beginning of the semester. COVID cases are on the decline in Clay County, in spite of the fact that we have less than 40% of Clay Countyans vaccinated. Statewide COVID cases are declining, in spite of the fact that the state is still less than 50% vaccinated, which in my mind, those are abhorrent statistics in both Clay County case and in the state of Missouri case. So what we have at William Jewell College is we have like an MBA bubble. We've sequestered people on campus. A really large proportion of faculty and staff are vaccinated. Over 95% of faculty and staff are vaccinated. And I believe they said that the students are approaching 90% vaccinated now. And so that's a pretty good bubble. The difficulty is that you guys leave campus, I leave campus. We go out into a world where vaccination rates are not nearly as high as they are here on campus. So, I was listening to a medical doctor last week on National Public Radio who just wrote a book called You Bet Your Life. You guys have probably not heard of this book. I had not heard of this book until I heard this guy being interviewed. And the book just came out and he was being interviewed, and his point was that there are no risk-free decisions. They're just decisions about risk. So I've been struggling for a while now on what to do in classes, whether to require students to wear masks or not. There's only a certain proportion of you who comply anyway. So what I'm prepared to do is basically relax the mask mandate in this course under a couple of conditions. So listen to my conditions. First, if you're not vaccinated, wear the mask because you need to protect your fellow students, you need to protect me. Now that you can actually see my face, you can see I'm an old guy. I mean, I'm a healthy old guy. I biked almost 4,000 miles so far this year on my bicycle. I'm a reasonably healthy old guy, but I'm an old guy. So part of it is in deference to my health. Part of it is in deference to the health of the people around you, in deference to the health of your family and friends. If you're unvaccinated, you should be wearing a mask everywhere that you go. That's just it. That's kind of the cost of being unvaccinated. Not only to protect yourself, but to protect people around you. The other thing that I would ask is that when you leave the campus, that you be cautious, that you take precautions. I go out to the hardware store. I'm in the process of in my spare time building a teardrop trailer, which means that I have to go to the hardware store periodically and buy wood and buy screws and things for woodworking. Anytime I'm off campus, basically I'm wearing a mask. If I'm stopping to get gas at the Quick Trip and run inside for a drink, I throw my mask on. So the reason that you should be cautious out there in the broader world is that less than 50% of Missourians have been vaccinated. Less than 40% of Clay County Missourians have been vaccinated. Don't think that because you live in a nice safe bubble here on campus that you also live in a broader bubble where things are safe. in general, because there are a bunch of people who just are refusing to do what they should be doing for the better good. Unfortunately, some of my family members fall into that category. So be cautious when you're out there in the broader world. The reason that you should be cautious out there in the broader world is it's very disruptive. If one of you tests positive for COVID, you come back to class, we're not wearing our masks, and then everybody in class has to go into isolation for a period of time until we all get COVID tested. I have a student in so the one case, if you read the email from the college, there's been one case of COVID this semester. It was in my Bio 133 class. Roughly half the class stopped coming to class as a result of that. One student was unable to take the second exam because of that, and she still hasn't taken the second exam. The same second exam that was on the same day as your second exam. It's amazingly disruptive when a bunch of people have to start missing classes. It's disruptive to their learning. It's disruptive to faculty because we have to invent all sorts of new ways of making sure that they're included in the class and that they get caught up to speed, et cetera, et cetera. So for 3 reasons: safety of yourself, reason 2, safety of others, reason 3, highly disruptive when somebody does get diagnosed with COVID and it just throws a wrench in the learning process. Please wear your mask when you're off campus, because there are a bunch of nutcases out there who are not wearing their mask and not being vaccinated. And I don't want you to pick something up someplace else and bring it back here. So for the purposes of this class on this campus, feel free to take off your mask if you are vaccinated. I get to see your face, we actually get to hear one another talk. But when you leave campus, keep in mind, less than 50% of the greater populace in Missouri is unvaccinated, and you should behave appropriately according to that. Because I don't want half of you to be not appearing because you're in isolation or quarantine, because Dr. Kowinski said we didn't have to wear a mask in class, and I took that to mean we didn't have to wear a mask everywhere. I'm not saying that. I think you should still wear your mask when you're out there in the broader world. I certainly am going to be wearing my mask out there in the broader world. But for this class, in this little bubble that is a fairly well vaccinated William Jewell College, I think it's probably pretty safe, assuming that you're taking precautions in other places. So feel free to unmask if you wish, or if you are vaccinated and wish. The other thing is, if you feel more comfortable and safer wearing your mask, by all means, wear your mask. I'm totally down with that as well. There are no risk-free decisions. There are only decisions about risk. All right. See, I'm an old guy. You probably knew that already, though. So we were talking about the Great Depression and talking about the economic upheaval of the Great Depression, and talking about kind of what the response to that economic upheaval was. And so talked about the stock market crash of 1929, talked about what that did to the economy in general, how people lost their life savings because banks folded and things like this. They lost their jobs because firms went under as a result of all of this. And so FDR, when he took over, he began a series of legislative priorities that came to be known as the New Deal. This is actually a name of these policies that was given to them because he actually said in a speech that he wanted to make a new deal with the American public. And we were talking about some of the things that were a part of the New Deal. We talked about the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and we talked about Social Security. That's a brief recap of where we were. Do you have any questions on stuff that we talked about last time? It is a bit unnerving to see your faces now. Jameson's like, I'm gonna smile at you. Any questions? All right, what were some other New Deal policies that came out of this? Probably the biggest policies you haven't even mentioned yet.
It had a lot to do with new jobs and infrastructure.
Okay. Yeah. Does anybody remember what some of the programs were called? Yeah.
Tennessee Valley Authority.
Oh yeah, you did mention the Tennessee Valley Authority last time. It's two N's in Tennessee, isn't it? Tennessee. What are some other things? Why are you so up on the Tennessee Valley Authority? I'm just curious.
Probably just the one I remember the best. I don't know.
Okay, all right. It's the one I always forget, which is why I think it's weird that you remember it. What else? You guys ever hear of the Civilian Conservation Corps? Anybody remember this? What about the Works Progress Administration? Anybody? These things ringing a bell in the back recesses of your brain? These were all programs that were funded by federal government funding that were designed to put people back to work. And when they put people back to work, they put people back to work building things. The Civilian Conservation Corps was a program that did a lot of work in developing national parks. The headquarters buildings that you go to that are so nice, these old rustic, but oftentimes very, very kind of majestic, nice visitor centers that are at the visitor centers of national parks. Many of these were built back during the Great Depression by people who were employed by the Civilian Conservation Corps. Works Progress Administration once again put people to work doing all sorts of government infrastructure plans, building roads, bridges, dams. Hoover Dam dates back to this time period. So the idea of the government was people were put out of work, people lost their jobs because the companies that they worked for went under as a result of the Great Depression, and so their response was to find ways to put people back to work. Give people a job, give people a reason to wake up and go to work in the morning, and basically restart the economy by pumping a ton of money into the economy. But that money was being pumped into the economy to provide tangible results as a result of this. And so that's what they did. And these things went into place, and American infrastructure improved a lot during the Great Depression, mainly because of these jobs programs. If you go back and look at the 7.5-minute quadrangle, the USGS topographic maps that they produce, their 7.5-minute grids, 7.5 minutes of latitude and longitude. If you look at the grid that covers Liberty, the 1946 grid, you will see on that map that there used to be a Civilian Conservation Corps camp right on the edge of campus. If you go to the baseball fields and then cut through that group of trees onto what used to be the field where the cross-country team used to train, there was a Civilian Conservation Corps camp over there. And so there were people all over the country involved in this jobs program. So basically, protect people's investments in banking, protect people's savings by insuring people's deposits in banks, make sure that people have a pension, even if the company that they work for goes under, and putting people back to work. These were three things that happened as a result of the New Deal. What else did the New Deal do? And now I'm thinking more about agriculture. This is a chart from, once again, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, showing exports. All during the first part of the 20th century, what's happening to exports out of America to other places in terms of agricultural exports? Are they increasing? Are they flat? Are they decreasing? Up until about 1940.
Pretty flat and then decreasing.
Yeah, they're flat to decreasing. And so exports are not doing great in the early part of the 20th century in terms of finding primarily a European market for agricultural goods. This is also occurring at a time when farmers are also being very productive. So you have higher productivity on American farms, coupled with a declining export market. What does that do to the supply of agricultural commodities? What happens to the price when you have a lot of something and nobody to sell it to? What?
It gets really cheap.
Yeah, it gets really cheap. So whenever you have an oversupply in the light of not very high demand, generally the price drops. Right now we have just the opposite problem in the United States. We have a lot of pent-up demand because people have been not buying things during the pandemic because they either lost their jobs or they were just being cautious in light of uncertainty. And now there's a lot of pent-up demand as we hope that we're slowly coming out of this. And because of a wide variety of reasons, there's less supply. And as a result, people are beginning to be concerned about inflation kicking up, inflation meaning rising prices. And so many of this, the issue with these rising prices is just there's less supply of the things that people want to buy. As a result, prices are going up. Believe me, with lumber prices, like I said, I've been trying to build a teardrop camper this year, and lumber prices have skyrocketed. Once again, that is mainly a supply issue rather than a demand issue. There's just been less lumber out there, and so the lumber that is out there is more expensive. And so during this time period, agricultural exports are in decline in the United States. They're still producing what they were producing before. As a matter of fact, production is going up. As a result, price is declining, and price is declining such that farmers are having a difficult time making ends meet. So at the beginning of the Depression, when a lot of people lost their jobs, one of the other things that happened was people actually cut back on food consumption somewhat. We normally think of food as a product with an inelastic demand curve. Those of you in business and economics, what does that mean when we talk about something has an inelastic demand curve?
It's like the demand isn't affected by like outside elements.
Yeah, demand isn't affected by outside elements. It's not affected by price in particular. When food gets cheaper, you don't consume more food because it's cheap. You consume food because you need a certain number of calories to survive every day. And as a result, demand doesn't fluctuate a lot. The only thing that leads to increased demand generally is increasing population size, because you have more eaters in the population, you have more demand for food. But when food gets cheaper, you don't eat more of it. When food gets more expensive, you don't eat less of it necessarily. You might eat differently than you did before. So for example, if the price of beef goes way up, and the price of beef has been going up lately, you might actually eat more fruits and vegetables, but you don't stop eating food because food has gotten more expensive. So food happens to be one of these things that has an inelastic demand curve. Demand doesn't really vary much due to, for example, price. So people had less money to spend on food. Luckily, food was relatively cheap, but they did cut back some because generally we have more calories than we need in the United States, and so we could all stand to probably eat a little less than we do. So at the beginning of the Great Depression, one of the problems for farmers was actually overproduction. So at the beginning of the Great Depression, what was one of the first things that the government did with respect to agriculture, and it was a set of policies found in what came to be, what was the Agricultural Adjustment Act. In 1933, the first of the beginning of the big agriculture bills that go through Congress every 5 to 8 years, depending on how well Congress has its act together. What did the first Agricultural Adjustment Act attempt to do? You guys talked about this in your groups 2 Fridays ago.
Was this when the government tried to get farmers to stop farming?
Yeah, they will not stop farming, but farm fewer acres. And so they basically had provisions in the Agricultural Adjustment Act that would basically pay farmers to take some of their farmland and take it out of production. And so you could get money from the government for establishing what came to be known as conservation easements, essentially farmland that you used to farm, that you're no longer farming, reducing the total acreage of farming, reducing the supply of food, which would then have the effect of taking food off of the market and increasing price as a result of this. And so they were basically trying to control the supply side of the pricing of farm commodities. What else did the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933 do? It once again was designed to pull commodities out of the market. I know you guys went and read up on this because I listened to you reading up on this. Yeah.
Bought livestock.
Yeah, bought livestock. In many cases, bought livestock and then slaughtered that livestock, took that livestock out of the equation. Yep. So bought up surplus livestock. So it's very controversial, especially because there were a lot of pig farmers at the time, and there were great pig slaughters at that particular point in history. What else did they do?
Didn't they start storing crops instead of selling them, so they could recycle?
That was later.
Okay.
That was 1938, the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1938. We'll get to that. When you guys went to school, did your parents pack you a lunch, or did you get lunch at school?
Mostly lunches.
Yeah, you got lunch at school. That's another Depression era sort of thing. One of the other ways in which they took agricultural products off the market was they bought them up and sponsored school lunch programs. And so that was the beginning of what came to be commonplace by the time I was a kid in the 70s. You just assumed that when you went to school, chances are you were going to get lunch at school. And it was
quite frankly, often cheaper to get lunch at school than it was for your parents to pack lunch, once again, because this is one of those federally subsidized programs designed to give kids, a healthy, happy lunch every day. Although when I look back at some of my grade school lunches, I wonder how healthy it was at times. But once again, it was subsidized, and you might think, oh, it's just the government doing something nice for kids, but it also actually allows the government to buy up crop subsidies and support prices for farmers. So the thrust of the first Agricultural Adjustment Act was to reduce production because farmers were having trouble getting enough money for their crops to support them. And the last thing that you want is you don't want agriculture collapsing on you, because then you lose a lot of capacity as a nation. A large proportion of the United States was actually employed in the business of farming at the time. Over 80% of Americans at this particular time in history were employed in the agricultural industry. And so it was a large sector of the economy, and this was one of the ways in which the federal government attempted to sustain that particular part of the economy. That was in 1933. What happened shortly thereafter? This is a graph of precipitation in Manhattan, Kansas from 1891 to essentially 2005 or 6. What do you notice about precipitation patterns in Kansas? Yeah, it varies a lot, doesn't it? Are there any times when there's a pronounced period of low rainfall in Kansas? Multiple years at low rainfall. This is 1900, 1910, 1920, 1930, 1940, 1950. Where during this time do you see multiple years with low rainfall? 1934, 1935, 1936, 1938. You have low amounts of rainfall in the Midwest. What happens to agricultural productivity? It goes down, yeah. Yeah, you can speak up. You don't have to communicate with sign language. Yeah, it goes down, it tanks. So in 1933, the government takes pains to get farmers to reduce productivity. They reduce productivity, and right after that, what happens is you enter a multi-year drought in the Midwest that is considerably below the long-term average of rainfall that leads to the Dust Bowl. So you just ask farmers to decrease productivity so that there's less product out there on the market, and then after that, you're faced with a multi-year drought when agricultural productivity crashes because of a climate-related issue that, of course, the government couldn't foresee. But of course, what then happened to supply and price?
There was no supply, so prices went up.
There's no supply, prices go up dramatically, and when prices go up dramatically, they're affecting a population of human beings who have less money to buy food, and so they're hit with this double disaster of they're in the middle of a depression, and all of a sudden food is really, really expensive. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, from the standpoint of reducing productivity to stabilize prices for farmers, ended up being disastrous because of something that the government couldn't foresee, which was a multi-year drought throughout the United States that led to declining production and very, very high prices. So that By the time 1938 comes along, they were taking a different approach to agriculture. And at this point, they were not only concerned about controlling production in order to keep prices at a particular level, but they were also concerned about buffering against food shortages that would drive prices up. And so in the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1938, they came up with a different plan, which Jamison mentioned earlier. What was it again?
The silos for storing food.
Yeah, they established something called the Ever Normal Granary. This was proposed by Roosevelt's Secretary of Agriculture at the time, and it's based on this biblical principle of storing up wheat for 7 years, knowing that there are going to be 7 years of famine coming after that. And this was a plan by which, during agricultural good years, years when crop productivity was really high, that would normally put a bunch of crop onto the market. A high level of supply would depress price. As a result of depressing price, farmers would have a lot of grain to sell, for example, but they would be selling at really cheap prices. Makes it tough to be a farmer under those conditions. During those years, what the government would do is they would buy up surplus. When they bought up surplus, that would take that grain off of the market, effectively reducing supply. And so the price would go up, which would then give farmers a living, a price for their crops that would allow them to maintain a living wage and stay in the farming business. In the event that agricultural productivity fell, one of the things that the government could do is they could use this stored commodity, these stored grains, release them onto the market, providing more supply so that an agricultural bad year of low productivity would result in prices not getting too high for the American public, the American food consumer. And so once again, it was a system of price supports, but it was a system of price supports that was aimed at not only manipulating supply when supply was too high, but also manipulating supply when supply was too low. And so this kind of illustrates one of the fundamental challenges of being a farmer anywhere, but also being a farmer in the United States. What am I beginning to draw up here? Is the graph illustrating what? It's the law of supply and demand, okay? Oftentimes, when people think about the law of, well, somebody explain to me how the law of supply and demand operates. Well, what is the law of supply and demand about? Somebody other than Aiden. I'm now tired of Aiden. Adam, Mr. Economics today.
It's when there's less products to be sold, they're going to be more expensive, and when you have more products to be sold, they're going to be cheaper.
Okay, so is the law of supply and demand, does it relate supply to demand, or does it relate supply and demand to price?
Price.
Okay, so a lot of times people mistake the law of supply and demand as basically relating supply and demand to one another, but the law of supply and demand basically relates supply and demand to price. And so if price is low versus price is high, what does that do to demand? If something is priced high, what does that do to demand? If something is really expensive, is there going to be a really high demand for that product? No, there's not. And so if price is high, there will generally be less of that being demanded by people, and so you can put a demand point up here. If something gets cheaper in price, what generally happens to demand for that product? it will increase, and so you can expect more of that product to be demanded. And so the law of supply and demand relates demand to price. As the price fluctuates, that price can influence how much that product is demanded. In terms of supply, if a company can get a high price for a product, what are they going to do? Well, so think about the iPhone. When the iPhone first came out, how much were iPhones back when they first came out? Were they cheap or were they on the expensive side for a cell phone?
Expensive.
They were super expensive. But at the time that the iPhone came out, they were the only cell phone with a touch screen. They were the only cell phone with apps of any complexity at all. What happened as soon as the iPhone came out?
Every phone became a touchscreen phone.
Yeah, every phone became a touchscreen phone because phone companies figured out what? And it didn't take much to figure this out.
Apps are monetizable.
Apps are monetizable. Not only that, if you have a touchscreen cell phone, you can charge more for it. And so when something is expensive, one of the things that the market does is it responds to that price point. And because Apple was selling this phone that was really expensive, all of a sudden, a bunch of other companies came out with similar products to take advantage of that price point. So when price that you can get for a commodity is high, you tend to supply more of that to the market. If you can't get a very good price for a product, are you going to be likely to produce that product? No, you're not going to produce that product, and so you will produce less of that product. And so this is the supply curve. This is the demand curve. And where these two lines intersect with one another is the equilibrium value for the quantity of a product that should be produced by producers and the price that producers should expect to get from that commodity. So this represents how much should be produced, and this represents the price at which that commodity will be sold for. Do you guys recall the recession of 2008? How old were you guys in 2008? 8? Oh, you were 8. Oh, wow. 2008. The economy collapsed to a large degree, primarily because of insane speculation in housing prices, which endangered many banks. The response of the government was to essentially bail out banks, which I disagreed with. I thought we should have been investing in infrastructure, put people back to work in a New Deal kind of way. President Obama and Congress disagreed with me. Amazingly, none of them called to consult, which I was very disappointed with. We spend a lot of time crawling out of that recession. We get to 2016, Donald Trump gets elected president, and what's one of the first things that the Congress does when the Republicans have control of the presidency and, in this case, both houses of Congress as a result of the 2016 election? The first legislative thing that they did was what? You guys now should have been in your teens. Yeah.
It was a tax cut, wasn't it?
It's a tax cut, and it was a tax cut for businesses and a tax cut for primarily wealthy people. Middle-income people and low-income people also got a tax cut, but the bulk of the tax cuts were reserved for businesses. Why did the government want to give tax cuts to businesses? At least what is their stated purpose for doing so?
Increase production.
Increase production. Okay. So you cut taxes and you put that money that you're saving, because you're not you're not having to pay as many taxes. You basically put that into expanding your business, which basically means hopefully hiring more people. But hiring more people basically leads to more production. So basically the hope is that when you give a business a tax cut, they take whatever money they have now that they didn't have before, and they'll sink it into the business, and they will increase the size of their business, which will hire more people, but the end result of that is it increases the production of whatever that company produces. Guess what happened as a result of the tax cuts in 2016? Well, I guess the tax cuts were actually passed in 2017. You see this huge increase in hiring? You guys weren't following the pulse of business back in high school? I'll just tell you, I'll spoil it. Studies have been done. Guess what? It didn't increase hiring at all. Unemployment didn't change. There were increases in employment that started in 2009 and continued all throughout the Trump administration for the most part, but the rate at which unemployment was declining didn't change at all. It was just kind of keeping the same trajectory that it was keeping before. Why didn't companies take all this money that they were saving in taxes and pump that into hiring more employees and producing more product?
We were essentially at full employment.
We were essentially at full employment at that point. What's full employment in the United States generally?
Just over 3% or so.
Yeah, 3 to 4%. There's always going to be 3 to 4% of people who could work who don't work for one reason or another. And so full employment is generally, upper 3s to lower 4% is what's viewed as full employment in the United States. So one problem was we were already kind of at full employment at that point. Why is it not in a business's best interest to hire a bunch of more people to produce more product because they now have a tax windfall because of a tax cut? Somebody other than Adam, he's clearly taken economics courses. The answer is on the board. You just have to think about it for a minute. Why do companies not take the money from the tax cuts and plunk it into hiring more people and producing more product?
Is that lower the demand, or would lower the price because there's no supply?
So if you're in the business of supplying something, you now expand your business to supply more of that. All you're basically doing is driving down the price of the product that you are in the business of providing. And if the market already is buying everything that you can produce, when you produce more, all you're doing is creating more supply on the market, which essentially dilutes the price of the product that you're selling. There's zero incentive for a company that has a market that is already saturated for its product to produce more of its product. All that leads to is oversupply and declining prices. So anybody with an ounce of economic knowledge, education in economics, would know that that's not the way in which you go about increasing employment, because firms are not going to do that. All it does is it reduces the price that they can charge for whatever product that they are producing, because as you increase supply, you essentially move this curve to the right. In the face of constant demand, all you basically do is you end up driving that price down to a second price point here, because what you've done is you've increased the quantity of whatever product you have. And so companies got a big tax break, and as a result, it didn't really have any effect on employment, because companies just aren't going to do that. It doesn't make economic sense to do such a thing. What does this mean for farmers? Imagine that you're having a good year. And when we oftentimes think of farmers having a good year, that means that weather is nice, and so what happens to productivity? Hmm? Productivity goes up. High productivity basically means that you move from this supply curve to this supply curve, but how is demand different in agriculture? It's constant. And so is this a sloping line? This demand curve? What kind of curve is this now? It's not flat. It's vertical. So the demand is constant. People need X amount of food. I'm going to get rid of these lines now because they don't really apply any longer. So now we have two different supply curves. Maybe a normal year, a good year, and then if a farmer has a bad year, what that means is that supply is generally lower than normal. And when you move from a good year to a normal year to a bad year, supply basically is going down. As you move from a bad year to a normal year to a good year, supply is going up, but demand stays the same because we all eat the same amount of food. We all have a particular dietary requirement for food. So in a good year, you're a happy farmer because you have a lot of productivity, but at the same time that you're experiencing a high level of productivity, everybody around you is also experiencing a high level of productivity because oftentimes these good years, they don't happen on one particular farm, they happen on all farms in a region. So everybody's having a good year. That means that supply goes way up. What does that do to price? Price goes down. So it's nice that you have a lot of product to sell. It's a shame that you can't get a very good price for it. And so even in a good supply year, a good agricultural year when productivity is high, you may struggle as a farmer because while you have a bunch of bushels of corn to sell, you're getting a really low price for each bushel that you do sell, and you may not make enough on those bushels to actually break even. Contrast that with a bad year. If you're having a bad year, everybody's having a bad year. What is your productivity? Your productivity is low. As a result of that, what does that mean for price? It means that the price is high. So all of a sudden, isn't it nice that you're getting a lot of money per each bushel of wheat that you have? But what's the problem? You don't have that many bushels to sell. So once again, even in a bad year, when you might get a higher price for your crop because there's less crop to go around, because you don't have much crop to sell, once again, you're also now in a financial bind. So how many of you want to go into farming now from an economic standpoint? Take-home lesson when you think about farming from the standpoint of supply and demand is it just sucks to be a farmer. Yeah.
Is like rain's still a huge issue today? Like, you know,
Is what?
is like how much rain we get still as big of an issue?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and both in terms of too much rain and too little rain. So what was it, 3 years ago? 3 years ago we had a lot of rain, and there were sections along the Missouri River, all through Iowa and into South Dakota, where the Missouri River jumped its banks. And even into summer, I went to a professional meeting in Utah, and I drove to Utah. And I drove up I-29 through Iowa and then cut across Nebraska on I-84, I guess it is. And all along the Missouri River, even in August, you look on either side of I-29 and all the fields were still flooded in August. At one point they shut down I-29 because I-29 itself was flooded that year. I don't know if you guys recall this. That was a year when there was so much rain that farmers couldn't plant crops at all because all their fields were underwater. So you can have reduced productivity because of too much rain. You can also have reduced productivity because of too little rain. You might or might not remember back to 2014 when we had a couple of years of drought in the Midwest. That led to reduces in the production of corn. This was also at a time when the gas standards were changing, such that there was a mandate by the federal government for gas producers to mix more ethanol into the gas supply. And the combination of drought, reducing corn supplies, plus the added issue of a portion of that corn being diverted into the ethanol market, you had a corn shortage and food prices went up for a couple of years pretty dramatically in 2014, 2015, 2016. Once again, a weather-related thing. We're a little buffered from weather-related issues because we have irrigation systems and stuff like that they didn't have back in the 1930s, but we're not immune to those things by any stretch of the imagination. And I think back to the soybean prices that we looked at the very beginning of the semester. Many of those swings in soybean prices were actually weather-related, things affecting supply. And supply, once again, is all that matters in agriculture because demand is relatively constant. So if you're having a good year productivity-wise, you're having a bad year economically because you have too much product to sell, and as a result, you're getting a low price for that product. If you have a bad year from a productivity standpoint as a farmer, that's also not a great year because even though you're getting more for your crop, you have less of that crop to sell. This is the plight of any farmer anywhere on the planet in reality. Good years and bad years in terms of productivity might actually end up having the same results in terms of economics simply because of the law of supply and demand in the face of an inelastic demand curve. If when food got cheaper, everybody just ate more, it wouldn't really matter because people would eat that supply up and that would maintain and stabilize prices. But that's not what happens with food because demand is constant. The price that it's at doesn't cause people to eat more, it doesn't cause people to eat less. I do not want to be a farmer because of this equation, because of this particular aspect of the way in which food works. The Agricultural Adjustment Acts of the 1930s were efforts to try and game this system. The ever-normal granary actually worked pretty well in doing this. Government would buy up grain during high productivity years. That took grain off of the market. That stabilized prices, so prices didn't plummet to the point that farmers went out of business because they couldn't find a market for their goods. During agricultural low productivity years, they could then release that grain onto the market. That would prevent prices from getting too high so that the normal Americans could afford the food that they were buying. And that worked pretty well. And that was the system that existed until 1973. And in 1973, the government changed the way in which they dealt with agricultural surpluses. What else do we need? Oh, have you guys ever heard of the Soil Conservation Service? Anybody heard of this? Another federal program that was a New Deal program. It was late in the New Deal. This was largely a response to the Dust Bowl. This was aimed at, once again, encouraging farmers to conserve land, not to reduce productivity, but actually to give the soil a chance to rebuild, because one of the things that agriculture does is it leads to soil erosion. And one of the problems with the Dust Bowl is that the topsoil basically blew away as a result of this multi-year drought. There were no roots in the soil because the plants all died. The roots in the soil essentially hold soil in place, and that's what led to these large dust storms and declines in productivity in future years because you lost a lot of the topsoil. So the Soil Conservation Service was established to work with farmers at establishing farming practices that conserved the quality of the soil and the health of the soil in the hopes of fending off episodes like the Dust Bowl from occurring. Once again, that came as a result of later agricultural adjustment acts. That was not in the 1933, but was in the 38, the 1938 Act. Still in existence today, there's still a soil conservation service within the Department of Agriculture, so that has been ongoing since then. We no longer have a Civilian Conservation Corps, we no longer have a Works Progress Administration, but we still have the Tennessee Valley Authority, we still have Social Security, we still have the FDIC, we still have the Soil Conservation Service. So many of these programs from the New Deal are still with us today, yeah.
With the whole, like,
Ever Normal Granary?
Normal Granary.
Yep.
Because that seemed like such a good program and really beneficial in a lot of ways, why did they cut it in '73?
A couple of factors that we'll get to when we get to that period in history, but I'll give you a little teaser. This is the productivity of farms. Once again, from 1948 into the late 90s, productivity started going up and up and up and up, and it never went down. Now, if you're the government and you're buying up crop in order to stabilize prices, storing that crop until there's a bad year when you then release that commodity onto the market, yet every year productivity goes up, what do you end up doing as a federal government?
You're only buying, you're not selling.
You're only buying, you're not selling. And not only are you not selling, you have to store all that stuff that you're not selling. By the beginning of the 1970s, there was this huge program at the federal government that was becoming very, very expensive, which was this process of not only buying up the excess crop to stabilize prices, but also having to build the storage capacity to store all that stuff. And so around the country, you would see these large silos that were parked next to railroad tracks. Many of those were government-funded silos that were essentially storing all of this grain that was being bought by the federal government. A couple of years ago, there was a series of these down I-35 in the river bottoms, right as you're going across the river, before you go across the Trent Lock Bridge. There was a series of very, very tall silos on the left-hand side of the road. Now there's actually a jewelry store down in that river bottom. Those are all silos that got torn down because they essentially weren't being used anymore. That date back to this time period when the government was spending a ton of money to support this program of buying up crop surpluses and storing them for long periods of time. Got to the 1970s, this was beginning to weigh on the federal budget, actually, and the agricultural secretary under Nixon figured out a way to not only get rid of the crop, but also gain leverage against Russia in the process, and we'll talk about that when we get to that period of history, but that's the reason that it stopped. It became expensive to continue doing that, mainly because we had decades of high productivity without any years of low productivity. So it became just problematic. So this is kind of what was going on throughout the 1930s. What happens in 1939 that kind of changes everything? World War II starts. War breaks out in Europe, and rather than doing what we did in World War I, the United States entered that war relatively early. In World War II, a lot of people, a lot of men went off to fight in Europe and in the Pacific. That depleted a lot of the workforce that was involved not only in manufacturing but also in agriculture. Many of the people, because there was such a large proportion of the population involved in agriculture at the time, many of the men who went off to war weren't men coming from factories and things like this. It was actually men coming from agricultural communities going off to war. Because of the loss of men from the workforce, because they were involved in war, women took up their place in manufacturing. The other thing that happened as a result of World War II is manufacturing capacity in the United States skyrocketed during this time period, because all of a sudden you needed a manufacturing sector that could produce the Jeeps, the planes, the ships, the tanks that were needed to fight a war. In addition to increased manufacturing of durable goods like heavy machinery that were the machines of war, You also had increases in the ability to produce ammonium nitrate, which is basically going into the gunpowder that makes the explosive capacity for bombs and bullets. And so during World War II, you entered this phase of a very fast ramping up of manufacturing capacity, of the kinds of things that are really useful for farms. Heavy machinery manufacturing, and the manufacturing of nitrogen-containing compounds that can also be used as fertilizer. Something just flitted through my head that I wanted to say about that, and now I've lost it. Oh, all that infrastructure that the government spent money on during the Great Depression, guess what? It set the United States up for being really good at ramping up manufacturing at the beginning of World War II. All of that infrastructure building was instrumental in the ability of the United States to ramp up manufacturing as quickly as we could. So you have this period during those 4 to 5 years that we were involved in World War II where the country changed radically. It changed the role of women in America because many of them went into the manufacturing sector. It changed the role of men because many of them came back from the war, and one of the ways in which the government repaid war veterans from World War II was by doing what for them? Yeah,
GI Bill,
the GI Bill. What was the GI Bill?
among other things, they're paying for college.
Among other things, the main thing that it did was it paid for college. So when you got back from World War II, if you wanted to, you could go to college, and they did. In large numbers, American veterans after World War II went to college. In many cases, the first people in their family to ever go to college. Because they largely came from farms, guess what they studied?
Agriculture.
They studied agriculture. They enrolled in agriculture and agronomy courses of study. Places like Texas A&M and other agricultural and mechanical colleges in the United States basically grew tremendously because of this influx of post-war enrollees. And many of these land-grant colleges that had an agricultural mechanical focus, Florida